The Appalachian Mountains stretch for over 1,000 miles, hiding ancient secrets, forgotten myths, and unspeakable horrors. Many travelers venture into these forests seeking adventure, but some never return, and those who do come back changed. Tonight, we bring you 4 terrifying camping horror stories set deep within the Appalachians, a place where the trees whisper, the shadows move, and the mountains themselves seem to watch. Are you ready to step into the darkness? Story 1, The Vanishing Campfire. The Appalachian Mountains are ancient, older than recorded history, older than the bones of the earth itself. People have wandered into these woods for centuries, but not all have returned. Those who have came back changed, whispering of things they weren't meant to see. For Alex, Jordan, and Cassie, the mountains were nothing more than a backdrop for their weekend escape. The 3 had been friends since college, sharing a love for hiking and camping. But this trip was different. They had chosen a spot deep in the Appalachians, far beyond where cell service reached, where the trails faded into nothing but endless trees. The first day was perfect. They hiked through rolling hills, watching the golden light of the setting sun melt into the treetops. When they finally set up camp near a quiet, trickling creek, the night air was crisp, alive with the sounds of the forest. The fire crackled as they talked about life, about their jobs, their futures, oblivious to the fact that something else was listening. At some point past midnight, Alex was the first to get up. He yawned, stretched, and mumbled something about calling it a night. Jordan and Cassie stayed up a little longer, watching the embers glow soft and red against the blackness of the forest. When they finally crawled into their tents, everything was normal. The fire was dying but still burning, their supplies neatly packed beside the tents, the cool Appalachian wind whispering through the trees. But when they woke up, everything was gone. The missing campfire Jordan was the first to sit up, rubbing his eyes. Something felt wrong. At first, he couldn't tell what, but then it hit him. It was too cold. The warmth from the fire had vanished. Blinking against the morning light, he stepped out of his tent and froze. The fire pit was empty, no embers, no ash, no blackened logs, just a circle of undisturbed dirt, as if the fire had never been there at all. A chill ran down his spine. "Cassie," he called, his voice hoarse. Her tent rustled, and she unzipped the flap, stepping out. Her face mirrored his confusion. "Where's the fire?" she asked. Jordan shook his head. "I don't know." Then they noticed something worse. Their supplies were missing too. The backpacks, the food, the lanterns, everything was gone. The only things left were their tents and the clothes on their backs. Alex's tent was unzipped, but he was nowhere to be seen. Jordan felt his stomach tighten. He called out his friend's name, his voice echoing through the trees. Nothing. Then Cassie grabbed his arm. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. "Jordan," she whispered, "look." He followed her gaze to the ground and felt his breath catch in his throat. There were footprints surrounding the tents, but they weren't Alex's. The prints were longer than a human foot, unnaturally thin, and dug deep into the soil, as if whoever made them was heavier than they should be. And worse, they circled the tents over and over again, a trail that shouldn't exist. Panic set in. Jordan grabbed a stick, his mind racing. Had Alex wandered off? Had someone taken him? Cassie pointed toward the tree line. There, barely visible in the morning mist, was a trail leading away from their campsite, one that hadn't been there the night before. Without thinking, they followed it. The deeper they went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of their footsteps on the damp earth. Then they saw it. Their gear was neatly arranged in the middle of a clearing, as if someone had placed everything there on purpose. Jordan's heart pounded. He stepped closer, scanning the area. "Alex," he called. Silence. Cassie picked up her backpack, but the second her fingers touched the fabric, she froze. "It's wet." Jordan frowned. "What do you mean?" She turned her bag over, and they both stared in horror. The entire bottom was soaked in something dark and thick, something that smelled like iron. Blood. Not alone. Jordan's breathing was shallow. His hands shook. Something was very, very wrong. Then a branch snapped. They turned toward the trees. At first, they saw nothing. Just shadows, swaying branches. But then the shadows moved. There, just beyond the tree line, something was standing between the trunks. It was tall, too tall, its limbs long and thin like broken twigs. Its skin was the color of the trees, making it almost invisible in the dim morning light. It wasn't moving, but Jordan knew it was looking at them, watching, waiting. Cassie grabbed his wrist, her nails digging into his skin. "We have to go." He didn't argue. They ran, escape, or something else. They didn't stop until they saw their car. The second they reached it, Cassie fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly she dropped them twice. Jordan yanked open the door, shoving her inside before climbing into the driver's seat. The car roared to life. For a split second, Jordan dared to glance in the rearview mirror, and his stomach turned to ice. There, at the edge of the woods, it was standing, watching them. But now there was something different. It wasn't alone. There were more, dozens of them, lurking between the trees, all standing perfectly still, all watching. Jordan and Cassie never went camping again. They never spoke about that night, not to each other, not to anyone. And Alex? They never found him. The police ruled it an accidental disappearance. But in their hearts, Jordan and Cassie knew the truth. He hadn't just vanished, he had been taken, and the mountains had never planned on letting him go. Before we continue, a warning. The stories you are about to hear are not for the faint of heart. They are whispers from the darkness, echoes of things best left forgotten. But if you crave the unknown, if you seek the truth hidden in the shadows, then join us. Like this video and subscribe to the channel. It may seem like a simple action, but in the realm of the unknown, every choice matters. And tonight, you might just wish you had stayed in the light. Story 2, The Watcher in the Fog. The Appalachian Mountains are filled with stories, whispers of things that move through the trees when no one is looking, of figures that stand just beyond the reach of the firelight. Some say these are just old legends, tales meant to keep people cautious in the deep woods. But some stories are warnings. Ethan and his father, Mark, had always bonded over camping. They had been coming to the Appalachians since Ethan was a child, making it a tradition to spend a week in the wilderness every summer. But this time was different. This time they went deeper than ever before, beyond the well-traveled trails into the mist-covered valleys where few dared to go. They should have turned back the moment they saw the fog. They didn't. And now, they would never forget what was waiting for them inside it. The fog that shouldn't have been there. It started as a normal trip. They hiked all day, following an old forgotten path until they reached a secluded clearing with a perfect view of the valley below. The air was crisp, the forest eerily silent, but peaceful. By nightfall, they had set up camp, the fire crackling. As Mark cooked dinner, Ethan sat on a fallen log, staring into the flames, feeling that strange, unexplainable sense that something was watching them. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark looked up from the pot. "Yeah? Do you feel weird?" Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "That's just the mountains. They have a way of making you feel small." Ethan nodded, but deep down, he knew it was something else. Then, the fog rolled in. It came fast, too fast. One moment, the sky was clear, the stars bright above them. The next, A thick wall of mist swallowed the trees, creeping toward them like fingers stretching across the ground. Mark frowned. That's odd. Ethan stood, watching as the fog slithered closer. Is this normal? No, Mark admitted. Not this fast. It swallowed the firelight, dimming everything until they could barely see the trees around them, and then they heard it. A whistle, high-pitched, hollow, coming from inside the fog. Mark stood up fast. Did you hear that? Ethan nodded, his skin crawling. What was it? Mark didn't answer. He just reached for his knife. The whistle came again, closer this time. Then from somewhere in the fog, a voice echoed, "Help! Please, help me!" Ethan's stomach twisted. It was a woman's voice, thin, distant, like it was being carried by the wind. Mark grabbed his flashlight, aiming it into the fog. The beam cut through the mist, but all it showed was empty trees. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing. Just that voice. "Help me. I'm lost." Mark turned to Ethan. "We're leaving. Now." Ethan didn't argue. The path that wasn't there. Before, they packed in record time, stuffing their gear into their bags as fast as possible. The fog was thicker than ever, and the moment they stepped away from the campsite, they realized something was wrong. The trail was gone. The path they had followed all day had vanished into the mist. Ethan's breath came fast. "Dad, the trail—" "I know," Mark said, gripping his knife. "Stay close to me." They moved carefully, their footsteps muffled by the fog. The deeper they went, the stranger things became. The trees looked wrong, twisted in ways they hadn't been before. The air was heavy, pressing against their skin, making it harder to breathe. And the voice, it never stopped. "Help me, please." But now it was changing. It wasn't just one voice anymore. There were dozens, all whispering, echoing through the mist, overlapping each other in a horrifying chorus of pleas and sobs. Ethan's hands trembled. "Dad, what's happening?" Mark didn't answer. Then Ethan saw it, a shadow standing between the trees. Tall, too tall. Its limbs were wrong, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The fog shifted, revealing hollow, glowing eyes staring directly at them. And then it smiled. The forest that kept changing. Mark grabbed Ethan's arm and ran. They crashed through the underbrush, the whispers following them, getting louder, closer. The trees moved, shifting when they weren't looking, trapping them. Then the whistling came again, sharp, piercing, and suddenly the fog peeled back just enough to reveal something ahead of them. A cabin, old, rotting, standing in the middle of nowhere. Mark hesitated, but then they heard footsteps behind them. Heavy, slow, getting closer. They bolted for the cabin, the thing in the cabin. The second they were inside, Mark slammed the door. The whispers stopped. For the first time, there was silence. Ethan caught his breath, his chest heaving. What the hell was that? Mark shook his head. "I don't know." Then Ethan noticed something. The cabin was wrong. There were no windows, no furniture, just a single rotting chair in the center of the room. And on the walls, there were scratches, deep, jagged claw marks covering every inch of wood. Ethan's heart pounded. "Dad, someone was in here." Mark swallowed. "We need to—" Thud! Something hit the door. Hard, then again. The wood splintered, the force shaking the entire cabin. Mark pulled out his knife. "Ethan, run!" Before Ethan could respond, the door exploded inward, torn from its hinges. And standing in the doorway was not a person. It was the thing from the fog. Its smile widened. The escape. Or the trap. Mark threw himself at the creature, shoving Ethan toward the back wall, but there was no way out. The thing stepped inside, its long arms reaching forward. Then a whistle. Louder than before, the creature froze. The mist rushed inside, swallowing the room, and suddenly the thing was gone. Ethan blinked. Mark grabbed his hand. "Run!" And this time, when they ran, the trail was back. They didn't stop until they reached their car. They never spoke about what happened, and they never ever went back. But sometime when Ethan dreams, he hears it, the whistle, and he knows deep down it's still out there, waiting. Story 3. The Vanishing Trail. The Appalachian Mountains are home to thousands of trails, some well-marked and mapped, others long forgotten, swallowed by time and the relentless creep of the wilderness. But every so often, someone stumbles onto a path that shouldn't be there, and those who walk too far down these paths don't always come back. Jake and Olivia had heard the stories before, the ones told in hushed voices by seasoned hikers around campfires. Trails that led to places that weren't on any map. Places where compasses spun wildly and footsteps echoed in ways they shouldn't. Places where people disappeared without a trace, but they were experienced hikers, skeptics. They never believed a word of it until the day they found the Vanishing Trail. A trail that shouldn't exist. It was meant to be a simple weekend trip. Jake and Olivia had planned their route carefully, following a well-documented loop trail that would take them deep into the heart of the Appalachians before circling back to their starting point. The first day was perfect. The weather was cool, the sun filtering through the trees in golden beams. They made camp by a stream, laughing, cooking over the fire, completely unaware that they had already gone too far. The second day, things changed. It started with something small. Olivia swore the trail looked different. "The map says we should be heading northeast," she said, frowning at her phone's GPS. "But the sun's in the wrong spot." Jake waved her off. "It's fine. Sometimes tree coverage messes with direction." But as they walked, things got stranger. The birds stopped singing, the wind died down, the forest became silent. Then they saw it. A narrow, winding trail veering off to the right. It wasn't on the map, but it looked well-worn, too well-worn, like people had been walking it for centuries. Jake hesitated. This wasn't here yesterday. Olivia stepped closer, staring down the path. "Where do you think it goes?" Jake shook his head. "I don't know, but we should stick to the route." But Olivia was already walking. "Liv, I just want to see where it leads." The forest that swallowed them, at first, nothing seemed wrong. The path twisted between dense trees, sunlight dappling the ground in shifting patterns. But the deeper they went, the more unnatural it felt. The air was thick, heavy, like they were being watched. The trees grew too close together, their trunks gnarled and twisted, as if they had grown in agony. Then Olivia stopped. "Jake," she whispered. He followed her gaze. Footprints, fresh ones, leading deeper into the woods. Jake's stomach turned. Someone else was here. Olivia didn't answer. She was looking at something else, a single shoe, half buried in the dirt. It was old, too old. The leather cracked, the laces disintegrating. But the prints leading away from it were fresh, and they weren't alone. All around them, barely visible in the shifting light, were hundreds of footprints, all leading in the same direction, none leading out. Olivia swallowed hard. "We should go back," Jake nodded. "Yeah, right now." They turned and the trail was gone, lost in a place that shouldn't exist. Panic hit fast. The trees were too close. The path they had walked just minutes before completely vanished. Jake pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. The GPS spun wildly, unable to pinpoint their location. "We stay calm," Olivia said, her voice shaking. "We retrace our steps." But no matter which direction they turned, the landscape shifted, like the forest itself was alive, changing around them. Then came the whispers, soft at first, indistinct, then closer. Jake's breath hitched. "Do you hear that?" Olivia nodded, gripping his arm. "Someone's talking." They turned slowly, and that's when they saw the figures, the watchers in the trees. At first, they were just shadows. Tall, thin silhouettes standing between the trees. Then the fog rolled in, curling around them like hungry fingers. The figures stepped closer. Jake's body screamed to run, but his feet wouldn't move. They weren't human. Their bodies were elongated, stretched unnaturally tall, their limbs moving in slow, deliberate motions. Their faces were blank, featureless voids of darkness. One of them tilted its head, as if studying them. Then, from behind them, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have. Come here." The endless trail Jake and Olivia ran. Branches slashed at their arms, the ground shifting beneath their feet, but they didn't stop. The whispers followed, pressing against their ears, their own names woven into the voices. Then, up ahead, a light, flickering, weak but real, their campfire. Jake gasped. "We made it!" They stumbled into the clearing, collapsing near the fire. The fog stopped just at the edge, swirling like it was alive. The figures stood just beyond it, watching, waiting. But they didn't cross the threshold. Then, just as suddenly as it came, the fog receded. The figures vanished. The forest was silent again. Did they ever leave? By morning, the trail was back. Their gear was exactly as they left it. It was as if nothing had happened. But as they packed up, Olivia found something in the dirt, a second shoe, old, rotting. But this time, inside it, was her own footprint. Jake stared at it, his face pale. "Liv, when did you step there?" Olivia didn't answer, because deep down she knew they never really left the trail. It let them go, for now. But one day, when they least expected it, it would come back for them. Story 4. The Forgotten Campers. There are places deep in the Appalachian Mountains that don't exist on any map. Places where the trees grow too close together, where the wind carries whispers, and where campers vanish without a trace. And sometimes, just sometimes, they come back, but they're never the same. This is the story of the Forgotten Campers. A trip into the unknown. 3 friends, Ethan, Rachel, and Marcus, had spent years hiking together. They prided themselves on finding hidden places, the spots that weren't in guidebooks or travel blogs. So when Marcus mentioned an abandoned campground deep in the Appalachian wilderness, they couldn't resist. "No one goes there anymore," Marcus said, grinning. "It's supposed to be haunted," Ethan chuckled. "You mean it's just an old campsite?" Rachel, always the skeptic, smirked. "What's the worst that could happen?" They didn't know it yet, but they were about to find out. The camp. That time forgot. The hike started normally enough. The sun was high, the air crisp. They followed an overgrown path, pushing through thick underbrush until the trees opened up. Into a clearing. There it was. The old campground, rusting fire pits, a few rotting picnic tables, and strangest of all, tents. Not new ones, old ones. Some so decayed that they had collapsed into themselves, their fabric shredded by time and weather. Others, eerily intact, standing as if their owners had just stepped away. Rachel frowned. "This place looks like it hasn't been touched in decades." Ethan stepped forward, nudging an old canteen with his foot. "It's like people just left." Marcus grinned. "Guess that means we have the place to ourselves." Rachel didn't laugh. She was staring at the trees. They were wrong. Their trunks were too smooth, too perfect, as if they had been carved from something artificial. The branches didn't move, not even as the wind picked up, and in the distance, through the gaps in the trees, something was watching. But before she could say anything, Marcus had already set up camp. Whispers in the dark. That night, they sat around the fire, passing around a flask and telling ghost stories. Ethan laughed. "I bet the real reason this place is abandoned is that no one wants to make the hike." Rachel forced a smile, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Then, as the fire crackled, she heard it. A whisper. Not from Ethan, not from Marcus, from the trees. She turned quickly, scanning the darkness. "Did you hear that?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Hear what?" Marcus chuckled. "Rachel's already spooked. But then, crunch, a footstep. From deep in the woods, Ethan's smile faded. "That wasn't one of you, was it?" Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. "We need to leave." But it was already too late. The unseen visitors, the whispers grew louder. Not just one voice, dozens, hundreds. They came from all around them, murmuring in a language none of them understood. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. The beam flickered. Then, for just a second, he saw them. Figures standing between the trees, their bodies twisted, their faces empty. Not people. Something else. Marcus gasped, stepping back, and his foot sank into the ground. Not mud, not dirt. Something soft, something rotting. Ethan's flashlight followed his gaze. The ground was covered in old, decayed clothes, backpacks, shoes, bones. Rachel screamed, "Run!" The endless campground. They ran. Branches clawed at their skin, their breaths ragged, the whispers turning into laughter. But no matter how far they ran, they ended up back in the campground. The fire was still burning, their tents still standing, but something had changed. The tents weren't their tents anymore. They were older, rotting, like they had been there for decades. Ethan's voice was shaking. "This isn't real, this isn't real." Then the whisper came, right behind them. "It's been so long since we had visitors." The forgotten ones. Rachel turned slowly, and there they were. Not monsters, not ghosts. People, or at least they had been. Their skin was gray, stretched thin over sharp bones. Their eyes were black voids, their teeth too many. One of them stepped forward, their voice soft. "You stayed too long." Marcus shook his head. "No, we just got here." The figure tilted its head. "Did you?" And that's when Rachel saw it. Behind them, half buried in the dirt, a backpack covered in moss, eaten away by time, and sewn onto it, her own name. The realization hit like ice in her veins. They hadn't just arrived. They had been here for years. They just forgot. Just like all the others, the forgotten campers, the ones who never left, the ones who became part of the whispers. Did they ever leave? Morning came. Sunlight filtered through the trees. The whispers were gone. Their tents were new again. Their gear exactly where they left it. Had it all been a dream? They packed up quickly, too afraid to question it. By the time they made it back to civilization, they swore they'd never speak of it again. But Rachel never stopped thinking about it, because sometimes, when she closed her eyes at night, she could still hear the whispers, and one day when she checked her phone, she found something that made her blood run cold. A photo, one she didn't remember taking. A picture of their camp, a picture of the fire, a picture of them sitting around it, but there was one more person in the photo, a fourth camper, standing right behind them, smiling, and that's when she knew. They had never really left, because once the Appalachian Mountains take you, they never let you go. The Appalachians are ancient, older than civilization itself. Perhaps the horrors that lurk there have always been watching, waiting for another lost soul to wander too deep. If you dare to return for more terrifying tales, subscribe to the channel. And if you've ever had a chilling experience in the mountains, let us know in the comments below. Just be careful, because in these woods, something might be listening.